Hey, thanks for tuning in for another Art Time with Jake. This time we'll learn tips for drawing realistic looking human eyes, and then I'll share some watercolor painting tricks for making emotive eyes and flesh tones. Inspired by Nashville Public Library's current theme on Hispanic heritage, I've chosen Hispanic artists as my portrait sitters. Here's the materials we'll use. It turns out I didn't need that smallest green-handled brush, as the other small watercolor brush comes to a fine tip that I was able to use for any details. I like the Reeves brand watercolor kit as it has warm and cool versions of the primary colors, plus black, brown, and white, which covers a lot of mixing options. You can also use the container's lid as a palette. I have a cup of water, sketching pencil, and some masking tape to hold down my sheet of 140-pound paper specifically made for watercolor, which has sizing in it to moderate its absorption. When drawing the eye, know that essentially it is a sphere resting inside a socket in the skull. It actually helps if you draw the entire eye first, as you will see how the muscles and brow frame it. The iris is half the width of the eyeball and placed in the middle, with a quarter width of the eyeball above and below it. This critical window of the soul is protected on all sides by bone, muscle, and flesh. The amount of eye covered by the eyelid does a lot to indicate mood. Let's take another look at the first drawing and see that the pupil is partially covered, which feels non-threatening. Typically, the iris will be partially covered by both upper and lower eyelids. If this is not the case, some extreme emotion or action is taking place. The amount of eyelid shown here indicates a more relaxed mood, and to the edges of the eye are smile lines, making this eye seem happy. If the smile lines are not included, this much lower lid begins to read as skeptical or incredulous. Let's see whose eye this belongs to. Thanks, Lavaz! Moving on, let's take a more neutral and contemplative pose from this photo of Frida Kahlo. I begin by drawing the entire eyeball. As we saw earlier, it can define the cavity of the eye socket and tells us where the cheekbone, eyebrow, and nose belong. Then the eyelids need to match its contour and arc around this sphere. The thickness of the bottom eyelid can be shown with two close parallel lines to which a hint of eyelash is given. It's definitely worth it to take the time to make an accurate sketch. I keep the pencil lines fairly light so they're easy to adjust and erase and won't stand out once the watercolor is applied. Time for color! Before I apply pigment, I lay down a puddle of clean water in the exact shape the color will occupy. I'm doing this so the edge of the shape will be softer and because I'll be adding another color before it dries. As the water evaporates, the pigments will settle based on their density. This is known as blooming, and the organic effect works well to mimic the iris. Just be sure not to overmix the colors as you apply them. Otherwise, you'll end up with one averaged color. Because I want the pupil to have a hard edge, I'll come back to it after the iris dries. I'm also leaving another spot of the paper white to the left and just above the pupil. This shape is a reflection of the light source. Including this makes the eyeball appear smooth, round, and moist. Just be sure to make it bend to the contour of the eyeball. Because the light source is overhead, as it is in most cases, the reflected light source should be found on an upper quadrant of the eye. Overhead lighting makes cast shadows in predictable places, like beneath the eyebrow. I'll be using a warmer color palette for the flesh tones, as it feels more fitting and lively. I begin by simplifying the image into three major values, which are highlight, midtone, and shadow. I establish shadow shapes first, but I still keep them fairly light for now. Watercolor is a transparent medium, and it's all about layering. Once these shadow shapes dry, I'll add a light flesh tone color across the skin, which will also be the highlight layer. Once it's dry, I'll keep adding more layers of color to become the midtones. I keep fine details like the darkest shadows for last. This way I know I'm getting them in the correct location. For this tutorial, I'll not be getting into makeup effects like eyeshadows and liners, but you can imagine how they would come in on one of these latter detail steps. I rarely use white watercolor paint, Instead, I utilize and preserve the white of the paper. As watercolor doesn't erase well, it's best to dab up mistakes while they're still wet before the gum arabic binder has had time to set. If the watercolor has recently dried, there is a chance to wet it again with clean water, and you might be able to use the brush to gently scrub up some pigment. But don't overdo this, as the paper will begin to pill. Now, let's take a look at an example of someone with heavier lids, Diego Rivera. The amount of upper lid covering the eye makes for a sleepy, relaxed look. After sketching my layout in pencil, I'll use the same wet into wet technique I used previously by adding 3 colors for the iris. As the watercolor dries, the sheen goes away, and we really get to see how our colors will look, which is one advantage of these time-lapse videos. I've come to learn it's more important to have the right value than the right color. And another way that I like to simplify is to apply the primary colors to the 3-value system, with yellow as the highlight, red as midtone, and blue as shadow. With the transparency of watercolor, one can layer the primary colors to make secondary colors, and if all 3 are layered together, a neutral. The system works well for flesh tones, and when I want to skip the layering to speed things up, I use the pre-mixed brown. But most of the time, I mix neutral colors for mixtures of red, yellow, and blue. In our final example, little of the pupil is covered, making the eyes seem surprised or intense. Typically, the more pupil we show, the more we're focused on something. Eyebrows generally just rest on the framework of the upper eye socket, and any deviation of this, such as increased spacing from the eye or bend of the brow, and heightened emotion is signified. Because the skin around the dolly's eye is rather stretched by this pose, the crow's feet, aka smile lines, are shallowed, and their shadows are lightened. Had I made these lines darker, they become like eyelashes. It goes to show, one value is relative to the other values that surround it in a painting. Give this some practice, and you'll see that you become more aware of what eyes are saying, which is especially useful during times when all that's seen in the face are the eyes. See you next time.